Why, hello there. Hey, welcome to the show. I'm one of your hosts, Bill.
And I'm Curtis.
Hey, Curtis, and together, as father and son, we are
your Geekdumb prophets.
That's right. How's it going, Curtis?
It's going pretty good today. It's been a good weekend. It's been a good Christmas.
Oh, well, yeah. Happy New Year. Merry Christmas. Starting it all right here.
Oh,
we got
course.
a little bit.
We tried to get the intro right this time. Hopefully we did. We'll see, and or maybe we'll just fix it like Disney in post.
In post, we'll just say that we're gonna fix that in post. That'll be our thing.
Fix it in post. That's all that Disney does, anyways. So we'll be we'll be just like the big guys.
That's right, because that's what we are, the big guys. Well, yeah. So we obviously didn't get a chance to get together over Christmas and New Year's. It's been crazy busy and good times.
It's been fun. Went to Virginia, saw Brooke, saw my sister and little nieces, your grandchildren.
My grandchildren. You're letting everybody know.
You're old as dirt.
Yeah, I don't smell like it though. Well, dirt doesn't have a smell, does it?
Patchouli.
It smells. I smell like patchouli. That's so sweet of you. You can't smell nothing from over there. I got the vid. No. I got the vid. I can't smell nothing.
No, we don't have plant life here. It's a desert here in Colorado.
Is it really?
No.
I guess it's not that bad. It's not that bad. So
it's pretty dry enough already.
It is. Hey, nerd check.
Nerd check.
You want to see what I got for Christmas?
I'm sure the audience wants to see what you got for Christmas.
I'm sorry. I got this cool shirt. Imagine that. I got a new Star Wars shirt.
Of course.
I know. Everybody's surprised. And I got, speaking of being old as dirt, I got this new Bible. That thing is huge. It is English Standard, giant lettering. Look at that thing.
That's still small.
Not comparing. I can see it. And then I got this really great gift from a son of mine.
Oh, really? What is this?
I only have one son. You're my number one son. Number one son, Curtis.
I would hope so. Striper.
One day we got to do podcasts on music specifically with Striper.
So it'll just be a Striper and Switchfoot podcast. That's what you're saying.
There you go. That Striper's my favorite.
Switchfoot would be mine.
And Curtis actually got me this for Christmas. It was pretty sweet. I didn't even know that the album had come out already.
I'm thoughtful.
It was very
thoughtful. He's like, you should get me this omnibus. I'm like, no, I'm going to get you something you have no idea exists.
Look at the graphics. It's like going back to old school, like when they did To Hell with the Devil and...
Oh man, you should see the rest of their albums that have come out within the last 5 years. They're absolutely gorgeous. They are so metal.
Oh yeah. And the Murder by Pride, even that cover was pretty cool. I love that one. This is awesome. Excellent Striper. So what did you get? Get anything exciting?
From
I didn't get your dear old dad?
I didn't get much in terms of excitement, except for one gift that I'm still very excited about. So, within the realm of collecting, for all you newbies out there that don't understand what something in box is worth versus something out of box is worth from the 1980s, specifically.
MIB. That's right. Mint in box.
That's mint in box. This isn't mint in box.
Okay. This is still just collectible.
You still come across every once in a while an absolute rarity that you just look at it and you go, I thought I would never see this in my life. Ever. What? So,
it was like when you were born. I'd never thought I'd ever see this in my life. Ever. A rarity.
This joke fell flat.
Yeah. Okay.
But
tell me the
my
rarity.
favorite.
What'd you get?
Let me tell you this story. And keep interrupting me. Now, I'm a diehard Transformers fan, as you can see with the Masterpiece Transformers in the back. Each one of those are rather expensive. Now, I've had the complete run at one point. Most of the 1980s Transformers comic at one point. Don't have them anymore, sadly. I'll probably go back and try to collect all those. I've all most of IDW stuff. Transformers have been a pretty big thing in my life since about 2007, 2006. I'd say probably actually going back as far as 2003. But if there's one thing that I thought that I would never get a hold of, it would be a 1985 vintage Transformer in box. Now, being part of a running comic stores and being a like part of toy sales, you come across items that you go, huh, that's cool. I want that. And you understand quite a bit of times what something tends to be worth or valued. Now,
Right.
in 1985, Transformers got a hold of a particular license to another franchise that I love called Macross. Now, Macross was not distributed here at all. It was only distributed in Japan. But whenever they distributed it here, they licensed it underneath Hasbro, not the original company Bandai. Well, Bandai started producing toys years later and thus restricted release rights to all of their products that Hasbro had previously licensed for their Transformers line. Well, this particular figure,
Big lead in here.
big lead-in, is the original Jetfire from 1985 in box. Now, it's not quite complete. There are a couple accessories that I got to go through and find, but the box alone can go anywhere from $100 to $300.
Just the
If
box.
you have just the box, pending if you
Not
have
the
the
toy.
insert.
Yep.
Not the toy. Toy goes for a little less than that. It's not quite as rare. People still have it. But being able to have the original artwork, the original box itself, all of this crazy stuff, I'm freaking ecstatic. Me and Dad found this at a Salvation Army.
I wanted that to be clarified. Who got you this?
This was very much my father. I turned this down. I wasn't gonna pay for it. And
That's
he went,
what. And thankfully, it would be your cousin, my nephew, Greg. He's the one that called me, asked me to come take a look at some stuff, and this was like a last minute. I thought we were done looking at all the stuff some guy had dropped off, and then he brought in one more bin, and when your eyes saw the top of that box, just reaching out,
man.
it was like,
Well,
we were leaving.
it's both near and dear to me because it represents two franchises that I absolutely adore, being Macross and Transformers, both having transforming vehicles. Love it.
Exactly.
So now to have both of those in one figure on a shelf, I'm just like, if there's any figure that I would have wanted in box from the original 1984 line outside of Optimus Prime, it would be Jetfire. So
Well, and shout out to my nephew Greg Bach. He's the officer up at the Salvation Army up in Cadillac. And dude, that was a great find. Thanks for getting us in there. Paid a good. We got a fair price for it, but still definitely want to help out with Salvation Army when we can. And things. So I'm glad we were able to get it for you because that thing is pretty sweet.
oh yeah, it's pretty freaking awesome.
Yeah.
But,
Now you just got to find that little piece that holds the gun or whatever.
Yeah, it's just a couple little accessories that aren't very much, but with the box being something that people tended to throw away,
Yeah, they just chucked them.
it
No worse
definitely
than-
makes me happy.
It's like the Lego instructions. Curtis would get Legos all the time from like Christmas, birthdays, and then he'd buy his own. He loves Legos, and he had a bin. I remember this. You had a bin in your closet that was a drawer just full of the instruction manuals, and you were like, "Oh, I can go out on Lego.com and download all the manuals." So you were like, "Why bother with all these instructions?" Just was gonna throw them all away, and I was like, no, let me check that out. Let me see if they're going for it on eBay. Sold them for like a couple $100 on eBay. Just the instructions. I thought it was pretty cool. You never know what's gonna be worth something. So other people's junk, another man's treasure. So
Wow.
you're still doing Legos, right?
Oh yeah, I actually just bought a Lego set just a couple nights ago.
Did you really?
Yeah, I had I had a Target gift card that I needed to use,
Oh,
and
okay.
I was
After
like,
Christmas gift?
Legos. I hadn't bought a set in a while. Well, never mind. I did buy a Lego Sonic set that's sitting on top of my computer right now.
Yeah, I was gonna say.
But I hadn't bought a Lego Star Wars set in probably about a year or two, something like that. About a year. I think the last one that I bought was the X-Wing at the start of last year. So I was like, I can't find any Transformers that I want. I'm really wanting to build a Lego set and just kind of play around with a small one. And so I bought myself the new Jedi Starfighter from Attack of the Clones.
Ooh, another Starfighter.
I love me some Jedi Starfighters. I own most of them. There's a couple that I don't have just because they came out whenever I was younger, didn't have the money, and now going back and trying to find them is, harder to find than gold.
Who's the minifigs that came with that one?
So this one came with a little R4 unit. So you have him here. Then on the inside here, you have the body for the droid.
Okay.
So it stores inside there, which is cool. The original one that this released back in 2002 did not have that feature. Then you have little Obi-Wan. He's inside there right now. Lightsaber stores underneath. And then you have this little guy who... You want to take a guess which character this is?
Oh, let me see. Tan Wee? Oh my gosh.
No, it's Lama Su.
Is it Lama Su? It is not.
No, it's Tanwei.
Oh my gosh. Brings back horrified memories. Okay, so for our listeners, this is a story that is like really important to us in my lifestyle. Okay, so Curtis, yeah, I got Celebration 2.
No,
we went to a convention.
This one wasn't at Celebration 2.
It was at Celebration 4.
This is technically Celebration 5. This would have been in Orlando in 2012.
Oh, here we go.
Oh, he's got that one too.
I got that one too. Celebration 5. Well, is that better? So, went to a convention. They had a trivia contest going with everybody asking questions. They said, okay, if you know the answer, you're going to stand on this side of the room if you think you know one answer versus another. It was A, B, C, multiple choice kind of thing. So it was the stupidest thing. It was like, which
which Kaminoan introduces themselves first to Obi-Wan whenever he first lands on Kamino.
Yeah.
We got it
was it Lama Su
around.
Or was it Tan Wee? And so easy. And I was like, I'm standing in the wrong spot with Lama Su. I know you guys are going like, whatever. It's two different names. No big deal. So I got there, stood in the wrong one. And even as I'm sitting there, I'm like, oh, man. Young Boba Fett even says, Dad, Don Wee is here. And I'm like, mess it up. Long story short, I got taken out. All the rest of the answers I knew.
We both did.
We both did. I knew all the rest. I could have gone all the way. The final answer, they hesitated. It was the first person to get who was the actor who played Uncle Owen, the original Uncle Owen. And I was like, I'm sitting in the audience like, that's Phil Brown. I know that. I got his autograph. And they were like, no. It took them almost like 2 minutes. They were like, oh, I could have won. It was this giant statue. It was heartbreaking. Heartbreaking.
It was a little heartbreaking. Well, I mean, whenever we went to Celebration 3 in 2005, the Lego booth specifically told me to leave because they had a little trivia contest going on where if you answered a question correctly, you would get a little mini Lego kit. This one was the Jedi Starfighter that appeared in Episode 3, The Revenge of the Sith. Yeah. So I won a total of 12 of them before they told me to leave. That I had to give all the other kids a different chance. This was in 2005, by the way. So the nerdiness has always been there.
You were 9?
11.
Something like 11? The other way. Going the other way. Okay, so yeah, Legos, Star Wars trivia has always been around for both of us. I get it. Still plays a part. All right. Well, I'm glad you were able to get another Lego set and you still keep that going.
Oh, of course.
Great opportunity. Well, we've been talking about in the last podcast the CCA, the Comic Code Authority. Can you explain that briefly, what that was?
The Comic Book Code of Authority back in the 1950s was the US government's reaction to parents complaining, specifically in regards to a book titled Seduction of the Innocent, which was written kind of in the same way that Upton Sinclair wrote The Jungle back in the 1920s, where people kind of overreacted to it and started writing their senators about the potential issues of children reading comic books. Now, most of this was in regards to stuff like crime comics or eerie comics or the horror comics that were being published at the time. None of this was necessarily targeted at children, but there was actually no proper rating system to distinguish between the two. So parents did have a particular issue and began to lobby their state representatives, either in the Senate or in the House, to try to have some kind of action by Congress. So in 1955, the CCA was more or less created as a response to this. There were many different things within the being approved by the CCA that you couldn't have. You couldn't have you couldn't have any drug use. You couldn't have any couples indicating that they were not married sleeping in the same household. Things like that, where that people became very sensitive to those type of topics at the time and didn't want them being even remotely shown to children whatsoever. So 1955 comes around as a response to that, and from there you get stuff like the 1960s with DC, where things become super, super campy as they try to remain kid-friendly, away from the very crime-ridden 1930s Batman, where, 1930s, 1940s Batman, where he was more or less on the verge of killing people a lot.
Almost all the time. That's right. Well, because I remember there's something that we didn't get to mention the last time was originally it was a psychologist, the guy who wrote The Seduction of the Innocent, Dr. Frederick Wordham. He was trying to push this, and specifically the director of EC Comics. He was so frustrated and so upset with this thing, he left. He took EC Comics, he left. And this is the part I didn't realize who he was. He started a different whole type of genre. He started magazines because it didn't fall under the Comic Code Authority. He was the guy who started, are you ready for this? Drum roll. Mad Magazine. Because it was a stapled magazine that didn't have to follow in the same guidelines. And guess what became their slogan? What? Me worry? Nope. No worries, because we're not regulated to their guidelines. We're not forced to. I did not know that, looking up the history of it, of just realizing, hey, we talk about, stump the nerd. This was a definite stump the nerd. I knew magazines came into play with Conan and the heavy metal magazines that we talked about, that they didn't fall under the same guidelines because they were a magazine style, not a comic book style. And, to see that this guy debunked the whole thing and was like, well, I'm going to start my own magazine that you can't tell me what to do.
It kind of helps later on down the road whenever you get with Marvel Comics and all their Conan stuff that was being published. So you had Conan the Barbarian, but then you had King Conan that was also being published. King Conan was not a comic book. It was a magazine format. And they got away with a lot more violence, a lot darker storylines. I think at times they actually did have blatant nudity.
Well, yeah, that was, I think it's mentioned that last time, that was one of my brothers had some of those magazines, and I was like, ooh.
Oh, and it was all in black and white. So
yeah,
the King Conan stuff was black and white. You had Marvel Illustrated at the throughout the 70s and 80s as well. All of that was all in a magazine format, not in the actual comic book floppies that we typically think of whenever we think of a comic.
And granted, you couldn't buy that at the same place you could buy regular comics. In my day, because of the CCA, you could buy comics at the grocery store. You could buy it at Barnes & Noble. It was there for everybody to see. It would be right next to the People magazine and the USA Weekly, or USA Daily, and then comic books. You could grab them on the way out. So the CCA helped in the guidelines as far as it gave it it could almost give a parents a false sense of security of stating, okay, there were guidelines that there's certain levels of appropriateness that my children could read this one versus, we talked about like to say there were certain guidelines even that you could only have Spider-Man do certain things because Spider-Man he was a great guy. He was a superhero that he had to always be shown in this light. You couldn't put him in, a mature rating type of magazine because this was something the kids followed. And so not only did it help, I think, regulate with certain guidelines about what could be written in a comic, but it also kind of gave a little bit of guidelines about a particular character and what extent that they could be written in because you have all these different writers writing the same story.
Well, and even to this day, well, until recently, you actually couldn't even put Spider-Man in a comic that was rated as parental advisory or teen, like anything more than teen. If you look at Alias, the comic Alias by Brian Michael Bendis with Jessica Jones, which there was a Netflix television show. If you have not seen that, watch the first season. It is excellent. Season 2 goes off the rails. But with that original Alias comic, one of the characters that Bendis actually wanted to have guest star within the book, because throughout the book, Jessica Jones is interacting with various members of the Avengers and other Marvel characters, kind of giving an almost secret background to the universe that this particular character has existed for years. Just, was more of a shadow type character and was kind of friends with everybody, just didn't actually help with any of the crime fighting due to her own drunkenness, you can say. But
her own inabilities.
Within her own inabilities. But Bendis actually did want to have Spider-Man appear within the book. That never happened, specifically because Stan Lee did not want the character to appear in anything that a kid could not read. Whenever Bendis relaunched a new book called The Pulse, which also starred Jessica Jones, at that point, it was more of a not child-friendly, but definitely a more family-friendly type book where multiple demographics could be reading it. It was at that point that Spider-Man did finally make an appearance within the storyline itself, finally interacting with Bendis' character, Jessica Jones.
Oh, that would explain the difference between the two. Well, that leads us into a good segue because last time we talked about the CCA, and then we're kind of leading into the challenges that Stan Lee and Marvel Comics were putting up against the CCA. Stan Lee didn't cross the border, but he definitely liked to push it with it. And so, one character that we really saw a lot of pushing happen was with one of our favorite characters is Daredevil. Daredevil, you mentioned earlier about Daredevil, for those of you who don't, same thing. There was a Netflix shows, 3 seasons, and now Disney
greatest thing Disney has ever produced, and Kevin Feige had nothing to do with it.
It was awesome. Same actor that they're trying to bring back. They're going to do a reboot. They've even been putting out new articles stating, Born Again. They're actually taking the storyline Born Again and rebooting it.
Born Again was season 3 to begin with, so why they're titling it Born Again is just so asinine.
Well, and they've been adamant about calling this a reboot because it's in the title, Born Again. It's not season 4 of Daredevil. It's going to be.
That's whenever you get into. That's whenever you get into the idea that Kevin Feige doesn't view any aspect of the Netflix shows to be canon. He never viewed them that way to begin with. That was very much the difference between Marvel Television versus Marvel Studios. That was a whole comeuppance thing between him and Jeff Loeb and a massive dick measuring contest.
Well, yeah, and that was the difference with Netflix got the rights, so they did kind of a co thing with Netflix and Disney because those were more rated M. Because
they were very much TVMA. They had a TVMA rating on every season.
Yeah, you don't want to have your little kids watching those. Jessica Jones, Daredevil, Luke Cage, and
What
then Iron Fist.
you don't want your grandchildren to watch Kingpin beat a guy's head in with a door?
Oh, well, it
Oh,
might be okay. He
hmm.
needs to show him how to do it properly, so that'd be better.
No, these shows did get really, really dark, but in contrast to the material that they're actually based on, is a lot of those particular characters tested the boundaries of the CCA.
Absolutely. Well, and that began with like even with Daredevil. If you go back to, for those of you who didn't know, Daredevil actually dated a lot of women in the comics. One of them was Black Widow. He
A
actually
lot
had
is
a
an
very
understatement.
a lot. Yes, that's right. He was a ladies' man. You
Yeah.
know, Daredevil coming out was, you know, he broke ground. Stan Lee constantly broke grounds. You know, he wrote the first, Black Panther was the first huge black superhero, and then Daredevil comes in, and he's the first superhero with disabilities. So he was already like pushing boundaries in those regards. But then in Daredevil's issues 81 through 83, early on, he starts dating Black Widow. And then they actually moved to San Francisco. So he's been back and forth to San Francisco a couple times now. You know, Mark Waid took him back out there again. But when he went out there, they moved into an apartment together. Now, again, this was something I didn't even realize at the time of when I was reading it, but Stan Lee was pushing the boundaries. He had to ask the CCA, the Comic Code authorities, if he could have them living together because they weren't married. So, how he got around it, because they rejected the idea at first, was they got a two-floor condo or two-floor apartment complex. And so Daredevil lived on one floor, Matt Murdock, and then Natasha, who's the Black Widow, lived on the second floor. So again, it was his way of working around the system, but still staying within it. You know, Daredevil was the way that it pushed. He pushed the boundaries. He pushed those, uh, and then going into what was it with Punisher, with Angel Dust. I think
Yeah.
he was trying to push the not push drugs, but it was a story about drug pushers trying to put this angel dust trafficking with school children, and he wanted to talk about it. And the comic code was like, no, you can't talk about this. This is not good. And so he was like, well, I'm gonna do it. I'm gonna talk about it. I'm gonna talk about it anyways. So he had to wait like 15 issues because it was originally supposed to be back in 167, and then but that it was during your favorite writer was
Oh,
Frank Miller.
Mr. Frank Miller. So, I guess we can start talking about good old Mr.
Frank
Frank
Miller,
Miller, who is, I mean, he's a great writer. He's batshit crazy. So, we'll
just a little, is he?
just, yes, genius. Had way too many strokes. Drugs are bad, children. You know,
Drugs are bad.
if
Drugs are
if
bad.
if the CCA had actually let Stan Lee put that story in there 15 issues earlier, could have saved good old young Frank Miller's mind at that point.
His mind was blown,
But that didn't
literally.
happen. So, we're going to talk about quite possibly one of the most influential runs in comics, period. Frank Miller came in and, let me pull up the actual dates here because, Marvel Comics, they have this tendency to put things into these nice, neatly collected hardcovers called omnibuses that collect key runs or entire runs or partial runs where they have multiple volumes set up. So you have
My favorite one,
Daredevil, Shadowlands, which
Shadowlands.
we may get into talking to that. That was written almost well over, I think that was almost 40 years after
40
this
years
material.
later. Yeah.
Yeah. So, in issue 158, in May of 1979, good old Frank Miller started drawing for Daredevil. Now, also at the time was another up-and-coming editor-in-chief by the name of Jim Shooter. Jim Shooter and Frank Miller really like to test the boundaries on what could be in a comic book. They, at various points, one of my favorite issues in comics period would be issue 181, which we'll talk about that here in a minute, and specifically what happened in it. But there was some pretty crazy stuff that led up to the culmination of that particular issue. It's a rather darker story. You had more recurring minor criminals that appeared throughout the run of basically he was utilizing a lot of them for informants into the Kingpin's drug empire. It was the run that really started to also steal various Spider-Man villains and making them Daredevil. Right. Kingpin actually specifically started out as a Spider-Man villain and has more or less become Daredevil's primary antagonist, along with
nemesis.
His arch nemesis, and then another character by the name of Bullseye, who Kingpin hires all the time. These books, they had some darker elements to them, but one of the characters that he introduced was a character by the name of Elektra. Now, if you don't know who Elektra is specifically, she's very notorious, much like Jean Grey of X-Men fame, for constantly dying and being resurrected in an unexplained manner, just because they're like, we want to utilize the character again. She was super popular, so we'll just, throw her into some kind of Lazarus pit and she'll walk out and be perfectly fine.
Another girlfriend.
This one specifically, they were dating in college, which there's another story arc that Frank Miller explored later on down the road, where they actually do explore those college days and the early days of Daredevil, right, whenever he was figuring out, what type of person he wanted to be as a crime fighter.
And she was actually in the Daredevil series on Netflix as well.
She was played by Elodie Young, and my God, they couldn't have gotten a more perfect casting.
Yeah, she was. I mean, I like Jennifer Garner, the Elektra from the original. I like her. She was great in Alias. Not so much in Daredevil as Elektra.
No,
but
she was a meh Elektra.
But I love Jennifer Garner. Alias was awesome.
Oh man, you want to talk about Jennifer Gardner and that terrible Daredevil movie? Then we can really start getting into how Ben Affleck later on started.
Let's
playing Daredevil and then playing Batman, but then that was Frank. Yeah, I know. We'll get into some pretty crazy stuff there. But part of what Frank Miller actually did was completely redefine the character. He started to progressively make him more darker, more brooding, almost more antagonistic, to where he would purposely try to antagonize people to start fights. It was definitely Elektra, the character, brought out a darker side of Matt Murdock that he himself wasn't exactly comfortable with at the time. He found himself becoming much more angry, much more short-tempered, things like that. So it just progressively got worse. Well,
it was like you going through puberty.
Yeah, I guess you could say that. Just, in this instance, you at least
got angered.
I'm sure you had the exact same experience. Don't lie.
No.
You're a terrible liar. Stop it. Stop it. But whenever old flames come into play from people's past, people tend to do pretty crazy things too. So, if there's one thing that we all know, it's that women make us crazy.
Hot Crazy Matrix proves that.
Yes, it does. But what started out as a progression of events basically culminates in Elektra's death. This is one of the first real times where a major character in somebody's run was killed, and not off panel. This was very much a major turning point for the book, where Bullseye is trying to draw out Daredevil, trying to draw out Matt Murdock. And let me go ahead and pull up the issue here. Trying to draw him out. get him to come and fight him. Kingpin's, trying to do Kingpin things, trying to ruin Daredevil's life. And things don't exactly go to plan.
And this was issue 181, right?
This was issue 181. I know the audience will see this backwards. I gotta fix my camera here. But this particular... I know, wonderful. This particular issue here, issue 181, the artwork... I'm not going to show much of the art in here because that would be issues with copyright, because Disney is mean. We'll just say that.
Well, mean.
They're mean. We'll just say that. But a lot of this issue, it's like this buildup of Kingpin, well, not Kingpin, of Bullseye, like it starts out with him, with Daredevil actually training, wanting to go after Bullseye trying to lead him out, Bullseye taunting the cops, doing all kinds of crazy things. He shoots cops, kills them, all kinds of crazy stuff's going on within this issue. But it's not even the climax.
All of that was pushing the CCA.
All of this was pushing the CCA.
Shooting at police officers, that was something you couldn't do.
Yep.
You couldn't show police officers in a negative light. That was all challenges to the CCA coding.
Yep. And so eventually Elektra starts to get involved, starts trying to hunt down Bullseye. They end up meeting, and a very, very brutal fight takes place. And it's beautifully drawn. If you have not read it, I highly suggest going to pick up one of the trades, because finding the issue is difficult. And the trades tend to be pretty regularly available for Frank Miller stuff. But it basically culminates in Elektra being ran through by one of her own size.
Yep.
And she proceeds to crawl to Matt Murdock's place and then dies in his arms. Not a very happy ending for a superhero.
No.
But the issue's not even over. That's the halfway point. Daredevil wants revenge.
Revenge, bad.
So he literally hunts down Bullseye, and they have another knockout fight on Skylines. And Daredevil doesn't want... He's debating. Do I let Bullseye fall, or do I catch him?
Should I stay or should I go? Bum, bum, bum.
And he lets him go.
He let him go.
Lets him go. Doesn't know if he survives, doesn't know, doesn't care, and just walks away and cries himself to sleep over the death of Elektra.
And again, nowadays, we would look at this and think, oh, it's just a regular comic. It's, it's put into the Netflix series. It's all those things. But this was 1979. You were not allowed to do these things, to write these things that were seemingly children or young adult reader books. This was a huge challenge to get them to even approve that. It was a smack saying, hey, this is everyday stuff. That people are challenged. Should I, I think Superman went through it. They did it with Batman. Do I kill this bad guy that's just going to keep coming back after us? Do I keep, the Joker with the
man, you can get into the Killing Joke. Also,
the Killing Joke.
That one's by Alan Moore. But that one ends with, you don't know necessarily if Batman killed the Joker or not. The laughing just stops, and it's all off panel.
Exactly.
It's a good book. It's not my favorite Batman story, not by a long shot, but it is good.
Well, I think it's interesting, like with Frank Miller coming in here, because, mind you guys, Daredevil's been around for a while, and so with this, it's not the same writer for 40 years. It changes. It went from, it had Stan Lee and Frank Miller and Ed Brubaker, Brian Michael Bendis, Charles Sewell did some for a while there too, didn't he?
Yeah, he did the 2000. He did 2016 to
Yeah,
like 2019, something like that.
yeah. And then Mark Waid after that. So there's writers that
Mark Wade was before, but yeah,
before, but there's writers that follow like a whole storyline that they bring them through, bring these characters through. And so each one has a different kind of a take on their personalities. We talked about how the key with Daredevil is you still have to use his roots. His roots go into that whole storyline of Born Again, is that his Catholic faith, his faith and his belief and the reasons why he's doing this are all highly important to him. You can't just all of a sudden write Daredevil and think, oh, he's a man without faith, a man who doesn't believe in God. No, he absolutely does. And so all of this should be written from that perspective. And so this was a huge turning point that Frank Miller's bringing into play with Daredevil. Is it's a toil and he's tossed and turned as a man of faith. Like, vengeance is mine, says the Lord. It's not supposed to be Daredevil's. Although Daredevil, the man without fear, also stimulates himself as that he is just an instrument of God, that he
he's an
is just
instrument of justice.
instrument of justice, not specifically God's wrath, but
Well,
instrument of justice.
as he always points out, he himself is blind, and justice is blind.
Yeah, justice is blind. See the correlations in this; it's phenomenal. It helps you understand, why people fall in love with this easily. That you can say, hey, they were just written for children at one point, but obviously it becomes more adult fiction or teen fiction or adolescent fiction, whatever you want to call that age, versus the adult. Getting into the Max comics, ones that are more adult oriented, and so it really is interesting to me is that this brings into play this whole idea of the CCA has been challenged. And then eventually we talked about, like last time, that it was pretty much thrown away in 2011, that hardly anybody follows this anymore. But there's a new set of guidelines that we start to see, not necessarily guidelines, but they become more what we talked about, self-regulatory versus federally regulatory, that they're demanded or made to follow a certain way. They become more self-regulatory and say, hey, I feel that this is a rated G type of comic, that all ages, or I feel that this is the PG or rated T for teen. And so this it kind of replaced the CCA, but I like it in the regards that it becomes more self-regulatory. But the difference here, and this is what I kind of want to get into here with bringing the parabolic reaction, is how do we respond to this? This whole idea is that to regulate or not to regulate. Is it good? Is it bad? Is it good sometimes? Is it bad sometimes? Is it good all the time? Is it bad all the time? That this, even that we naturally push our boundaries. I think we as humans, ever since the fall with Adam and Eve, that we always like to push our boundaries. We push, what are the guidelines? Are they, as they would say with Jack Sparrow, they're more of a guidelines anyhow. It's not, it's
the
not
code.
the rules. Right.
The pirate code.
It's the pirate code, more of a guidelines anyhow. Do we go according to what Judges 21:25, that we don't want to go to the extreme of, in those days Israel had no king, and so since there was no king, there was no federal regulations, there were no type of guidelines. Every man did what he saw was fit, or every man did, some translations would say, every man did what was right in his own eyes. So, how do we go to the extremes of saying, okay, no guidelines, no nothing, anybody can write whatever you want? So if you walked into a store right now, walked into Barnes & Noble and picked up a comic book, well, yeah, went to the graphics section and picked up a graphic novel, not having any clue whether or not this would be appropriate for your 5-year-old versus your 19-year-old. How would you, what are you? I think we keep defining this. Are you technically a millennial? I don't know.
Technically, yeah.
Technically, how do you feel as a millennial? Because me, coming out of a different generation, obviously, I look at these things in a different aspect. Like, hey, should there be some things that are appropriate for a certain age, or do you just allow 5-year-olds to watch horror movies? Do you allow 5-year-olds to watch Game of Thrones? I
No.
mean, we joke and laugh, but I know full well I have friends that, let their if it's good enough for me, as long as I'm sitting next to them and explaining the difference, it's okay. So like I said, you as the viewers writing in your own words and your own concepts of, is there a level of age appropriateness that should be put into play? I and even the self-regulatory. For instance, you, Curtis, you as a comic book manager, when parents would come into the store, and I remember you telling me a story about them picking up some rated mature
Oh,
video game for their kid.
most of the time, like whenever it came to video game stuff, you'd have parents come in with their kids, and their kids would be like, "Oh, I want to play Grand Theft Auto." And they come
Because
up
it's
and they're
popular.
because
It's
it's
popular.
popular.
Yep.
And they come up and they're kids maybe like 10, 11, I don't know. It's something around that age that they're going to be shit talking on the line anyways.
Yeah.
I often they would buy the game, and I'd go, "Are you buying it for your kid?" And they go, "Yeah, he wants to play it." I'm like, "Do you know what's in this game?" They go, "No." I'm like, "You may want to look up what's in this game before you decide to buy it for your kid." I'm like, "You can go around and kill strippers. You can go around and kill hookers. You can go around and hijack cars. I mean, it's fun to do whenever, you're a full-grown adult and you understand the difference between reality and fantasy. But whenever you're developing, it's like, I don't necessarily know if I want kids to be playing a lot of this particular stuff. It gets violent, it gets bloody, it gets into concepts that I really feel like, I don't know, I'm not a parent, but I still dealt with kids that would run around saying stuff that I'm like, "Do you know what that means?" They go, "No." Like, okay,
Stop
so
saying
nobody
it.
even explained it to you to begin with, so what's the
Stop
point?
saying it.
Yeah, stop
Well,
saying it.
and the thing is that I saw with, being your parent and stepping back, there's a level of trust that I would notice with you. You would trust me over, I would hope, the guy at the gas station that you met, that you would trust
Oh,
my
yeah.
understandings more so than his. And so the parent coming in to the comic book shop and hearing your justifications or um, your perspective of it, to say, hey, that may not be appropriate. I think part of regulation comes. I think an important part of that is trust. Is yes, they're self-regulatory, but do you trust what they're calling regulations versus what might have been with the federal? Because obviously that was, I think, some of the biggest push with the CCA is they didn't like it because it was like, hey, wait a minute. It's not that we're writing. We mentioned this once last time, but reminding people that the CCLA was written specifically because they thought comics were being written for children, and understanding that some comics are, so they wanted something that defined the difference to say, okay, these are going to be more teen or adult oriented. Or if you want to go to the extreme, go to the magazine and say, go to Mad magazines, that these are not for kids. So there's a level one regulation, but two, there's a level of trust in who is providing those regulations or those standards. And so I think that's where it's important for any parent. Well, me as a Christian, for sure, as I'm looking at, hey, what's some of the guidelines that the Bible may give. I'm not saying that I'm perfect in any way. We mentioned before about the Ten Commandments and guidelines that we would like to try to follow. I try the best of my ability, and we're not going to hit the mark 100% every time. I would like to say we do, but I, I've sinned and fallen short of the glory of God. And I'm sure you have. Wait a minute, I'm your dad. Yes, you have a couple times. You've rebelled against your father and your mother. But
Rebelled.
there's
Oh
those.
man, if you want to talk, if you want to say that sitting around in my room and doing absolutely nothing is rebelling, then sure.
No, that's right. No, you. So I think it could be summed up almost in this verse because I think let's back up just a little bit. I think there's an importance here with guidelines. You as parents, we as collectors, that hey, there's a certain level of accountability that needs to be held of what our own personal standards versus what we may show our children. Like I wouldn't have shown you certain levels of some of the comics that we might be reading. I wouldn't have showed those to you when you were 5 or 10 because I think the Bible says it goes to the extreme. Every man did what was right in their own eyes. But then it also goes into explaining, like 1 Corinthians 13, for example. There are a set of guidelines that establishes what is love. These different things that explains, like love never ends, love is patient, love is kind, it does not boast. It gives a guidelines, if you want to look at it that way, of how love is defined or how love is can be displayed to one another. So I think the Bible is emphatic about explaining that there is a difference, that there are some guidelines, and I think this is where it's always careful to say, uh, we talked about this a little bit before, right and wrong versus appropriate and inappropriate. That's probably a whole nother conversation of morality versus absolutes, morality versus, we talked way back in the first podcast, slight difference between, what's ethical versus moral. Is this right? Is this wrong? Or is it just inappropriate at this point? That there's a level. So I think the Bible sums it up pretty clearly with 1 Corinthians 10:23. It says, all things are permissible, but not all things are beneficial. I mean, that's something I used to live by. All things are permissible, not all things are beneficial. It's not going to be to the best of your benefit. An example, how about our, as collectors, our purchasing power? You
Oh,
know what I'm saying?
purchasing power, wonderful, wonderful, wonderful purchasing power. You mean this glorious book that I literally purchased today?
Oh, that's beautiful. Another
Yeah,
omnibus? I
yeah,
like that.
another Superman omnibus. Now, but I understand what you're saying in that regard. We, as collectors, one of the things that we like to do is hunt for things that we may or may not actually need for said collection, but we have the desire to start some aspects of the collecting. Like with you with your Star Wars figures, you may not necessarily need every character, but you start with one particular theme and you go from there. Now, one of the things that I tend to have issues with is it may not necessarily be wrong for me to go on eBay, find some transformer that I've been looking for, and drop $80 or more on said transformer whenever I could have been utilizing that money towards something else. It's not necessarily wrong, but it may be inappropriate at the time. I may have bills coming up. I may have something that's going to be due in terms of, like rent or something else that I had on order that I completely forgot about.
Right.
That happens. And so it's an inappropriate decision to be making at that moment. That's going to hurt me in the long run. It's not necessarily a wrong one, but it's not necessarily an appropriate one.
There you go. So that brings with the regulation, we talked about trust, the appropriateness, but then third and lastly is going to be the whole idea of consequences. That there are consequences for our choices, one way or the other. Like you said, I'm going to choose to this, and we're using a very simple context of idea of just buying something. But we could take that into our personal lives, in our relationships. If I get involved in this relationship, how is this going to affect me later? Isn't it appropriate? Will it hurt me down the road? Or is it going to hurt me now? And so sum this up with a perfect example of appropriateness and trying to understand, push the boundaries. How far do we go? Stan Lee, again, the great man Stan Lee, going back and writing Spider-Man, he challenged the CCA. He was like, hey, I want to talk about drugs. I want to talk about how these drugs are being trafficked and pushed on children. At the time, ironically, the Department of Health came to him and saw how much comic books were affecting mainstream, the children as well as teenagers, and how much it was affecting just mainstream pop culture, and that people were actually reading this. So they wanted him to come in and put something in a positive stint about, hey, drugs are bad. We joke about, when we were kids, Spider-Man going, hey, don't do drugs, kids, things like that. That was all part of a Department of Health coming in, pushing what they thought was a positive agenda. But the CCA, which was the guidelines comics were supposed to hold to, was saying, no, you can't talk about those things. So you have two different government factions telling you two different things. So Stan Lee was like, what do I do? What do I do? So he writes these issues, Amazing Spider-Man, issues 96 through 99, where he does choose to talk about these things because he thought it was very prevalent in nature and society at the time. And he actually chose to go out there and write these without printing or putting the stamp on the front cover of this Comic Code Authority without their approval. So he did it anyways. He basically said, well, I'm going to do it. What are you going to do about it? And guess what? The world didn't end. In fact, Stan Lee was praised by the government, by mainstream, even including churches, were very excited and positive about the influence that he had had. So it's understanding the regulations, to regulate or not to regulate. Sometimes that involves the level of trust in who's telling us what to regulate. There's the whole idea of there's going to be what's appropriate versus inappropriate, and there's going to be those consequences. And are you willing and ready to face those consequences? When you're showing your 5-year-old children horror stories and horror movies, and you can't understand why they can't sleep at night because they're having nightmares, you might want to start thinking about some of those consequences. So this podcast here has been an awesome way that Curtis and I can express our love for geekdom and the geekdom world, but also the dual aspect of understanding the importance of in our lives of the guidelines that we hold to, and we don't, like I said, we don't hit that mark every time. We try. We are to continue to strive for that. And, sometimes we mess up. I'm not saying we're 100%, but that's what we're here for, is to encourage one another and to love one another. So appreciate you guys listening tonight. Curtis, it's great always to talk with you about the CCA.
And of course.
I think next time, we've kind of been leading into this. I think next time we are going to be talking a little bit about Spider-Man. We had some great characters coming up, and Batman and Superman, of course, coming along the way too. But
all right. Course.
All right. Well, I appreciate you guys listening. And Curtis, you ready for the outro?
Yeah.
Get a listen to some awesome music from my brother Scott. He wrote some incredible music. But thanks for listening. I am Bill.
And I'm Curtis.
And we are father and son, and we are your
Geekdom Prophets.
We are. Peace out. Remember, perspective is either your prison or your passport.
See ya.
See ya, guys. Thanks for coming. Come back again sometime.